I groaned as I tried to force my eyelids open. Sunlight poured in through the blinds, a cruel attempt to blind me. My head pulsed, every heartbeat a dull throb of pain. What did I do last night? Everything after dinner was a haze. Oh, right. The bottle of tequila with Michael. 2 stupid 18-year-olds with booze. Who could have predicted that wouldn't turn out well? I ducked under the covers, wrapping my arms around my head as I tried to block out the assault on my senses. Why did the sun have to be so bright? And exactly where did the driver repeatedly smashing into my brain with his truck get his license? This hardly seemed fair. Certainly too much of a punishment for the crime of underage drinking. Footsteps creaked in the hallway. Oh, God, I thought to myself. Mom. Of course she was picking this moment to bother me. She walked into my room without knocking, because why would she not? She had never been a big personal space person. Her footsteps continued across the floorboards, stopping right beside my bed. Evelyn, her voice was sharp, as if she was attempting to cause further agony in my head with her words alone. I burrowed deeper into the blankets, wincing as I accidentally applied too much pressure to one of my temples. Evelyn Stone, get out of bed this minute, she barked, snatching the covers off me. Surprisingly, the cool room air helped to cut through my mental haze somewhat, but I still refused to open my eyes. I wasn't ready to face anything in the world quite yet, especially her. Judging from the smell that wafted off of her, she had indulged herself the previous night as well. No, thank you, I murmured as I attempted to drag the covers back up. Before I could do so, she pulled them completely off the bed and dropped them onto the floor. With that bit of drama out of the way, she marched out of my room without another word. I was grateful for the silence, but that gratefulness turned to more pain as she slammed the door behind her. I sighed. Okay then. The sooner I got up and found a way to shut up the dozen drummers banging away in my skull, the sooner I could get out of the house and away from my mother. I forced myself out of bed with great effort and shuffled over to the dresser to rummage through the drawers for some clothes. I managed to recover a worn-out Nirvana t-shirt and a pair of jeans. My reflection in the mirror on top of the dresser caught my attention. There were dark circles under my eyes, and my long red hair looked like a flock of birds had gotten into a fight inside of the locks. I dragged myself into the bathroom, fiddling with the shower knobs until the water was piping hot. I took off my rather odorous clothes I had been sleeping in and tossed them into a pile before getting in. I sighed as the warm water flowed over me and breathed in the steam deeply. Some of the fog began to lift. My body eventually started to relax. With each passing moment, I felt more like a human being. Eventually, I turned off the shower, dried myself off, and went about the business of tackling the knot of my hair with a wide-tooth comb. The tangles put up a hell of a fight, but I've always been a stubborn person. Eventually, the snags relented, and I was able to get everything smoothed out. Although I typically wasn't all that concerned about my appearance, my hair had always been something of an exception to that rule. Now that I was able to process what was going on around me better, I noticed my mouth tasted absolutely disgusting. I brushed my teeth, a bit surprised that whatever had crawled in there and died didn't fall out as I did so. With one last glance in the mirror, I got dressed and went back into my room to grab my backpack and sunglasses. Sliding the glasses on helped to fend off the unwarranted assault that the sun was coming at me with. Thank goodness for small favors and all that. My stomach rumbled. How long had it been since I had last eaten? I was pretty sure that it had been hours before the impromptu drinking session had begun. I had been drinking on an empty stomach. Amateur mistake. I slipped on my backpack before nodding once to myself and creeping out of my room. I wasn't ready for a more in-depth confrontation with my mother, and I knew that the moment she spotted me, the torrent of lectures would begin. As if she had any room to criticize how someone else lived their life. My stomach growled again. I silently told it to remain silent. I could get food when I got into town. It would just have to wait. I made my way down the stairs and stopped at the bottom to listen intently. After a moment, I heard my mother moving around in the kitchen. I hurried into the living room and out the front door, closing it as quietly as I could. I tiptoed down the stairs, the ancient porch boards creaking slightly with every step. I eventually reached the bottom, and I smiled as I walked along the side of the house. I knew that I was home free at this point. The fresh early spring air washed over me as I walked. It still had that peculiar sharp edge of winter, but I loved this time of year. I drew a deep breath and simply enjoyed the moment as the smells of ozone and damp earth filled my nostrils. I soon reached the unlocked door of the garage. I went inside and retrieved my bike. My hand automatically went to the tires, pushing against them to check the pressure. I had once been stranded half a dozen miles from home when one of the tires had gone flat, and that had led to an odd paranoid ritual that I always performed before taking the bike out. Within minutes, I was coasting down the driveway and turning onto the street. I lived in one of the older neighborhoods in Lamplight Woods. Most of the homes were just as run down as my own was. I ignored that depressing thought and focused on the positives. Each pump of the pedals took me further away from my psychotic mother, and that was certainly something worth keeping right at the forefront of my mind. I picked up speed and grinned broadly. Hangover be damned. I was going to have a good day. Or die trying. I snorted. Maybe not the best turn of phrase in this particular town. Instead of heading into town like I originally planned, I almost automatically veered off the main street and onto an unpaved road as I headed toward a different destination. As I rode on, the trees grew closer together, making it difficult to see in between them. I noticed, like I always did when I came this way, that the shadows seemed a little deeper here, a little darker. I turned a corner, and suddenly the distance between the trees widened, and the store came into view. I felt a sense of relief that I was annoyed by, but also couldn't deny. No matter how many times I went down that road, I always felt creeped out by it. As I drew closer, I could see the faded sign on the post in the front yard slowly rocking back and forth in the breeze. It was old and faded, and I could just barely make out the words "Forgotten Tales" painted on it. The store itself was a 2-story house that had been converted into a sort of combination antique store and thrift shop. It sold a hodgepodge of items that seemed to have no rhyme or reason as to why they coexisted with one another. The owner and his son lived there, their rooms upstairs. Forgotten Tales was strange and foreboding, and sometimes even disturbing. It also felt more like home to me than my actual house. That probably said something about me. As I approached, I could hear shouting coming from inside the building. I arrived at the front of the driveway and hesitated for just a moment before setting my bike down on it and heading towards the door. As I walked across the grass towards the front door, the shouting grew louder. Before I could reach the porch, the door burst open and Michael stormed out, his entire body tensed up in anger. He was dressed in his usual attire, jeans and a worn-out hooded sweatshirt with the hood pulled up. It was rare that the hood wasn't pulled up. It was a habit he'd developed over the years to conceal his blemishes. He was carrying his backpack in one hand. As I drew closer, I could see fresh bruising on his right cheek, the purple swelling already standing out against his pale skin. My heart sank, a familiar knot twisting in my stomach. I'd seen this before on an all too frequent basis. The bruise was his father's handiwork. Michael was so consumed by his own rage that he didn't see me at first. He turned his head to watch the door as he walked down the porch stairs and muttered under his breath. I simply watched him silently. I knew that he needed to cool off on his own. As much as I knew he loved me and how he valued our time together, he was a solitary creature by nature. When he finally spotted me, his anger faltered and his muttering stopped. An odd expression crossed over his face, a mixture of relief and shame. Almost instantly, he regained control, and he returned to the forced calm I recognized so well. He forced a wry smile. "Hey, Evie," he greeted me simply. I didn't return the smile. Instead, I crossed the distance between us and raised a hand to push his hood away from his cheek so that I could get a better look. "Jesus, Michael," I said as I examined the bruise. "Are you okay?" Michael shrugged, a casual gesture that didn't fool me for a second. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just the usual calm discussion between me and my dear old dad." A discussion that obviously ended with his fist meeting your face. Damn it, Michael. An inch higher and you'd be blind in one eye. He opened his mouth to reply, likely with a joke or sarcastic remark. But he must have seen something on my face, and he closed it again without speaking. Most of the time, I was every bit as willing as he was to laugh things off. Not when it came to things like this, though. Never when it came to things like this. "I really am okay, Evie," he assured me finally. "It's not as bad as, well, as bad as a lot of the other times." I wanted to tell him that enough was enough, and that it was time to put a stop to this and report his father to the police. I held my tongue. It wasn't that simple. It should have been, but it wasn't. Lamplight Woods was a strange town. Most small towns have their little quirks, but Lamplight Woods, it went beyond quirky. It was home to the weird and strange, a particular font of unexplained and blatantly paranormal activity. No one knew why. There were theories, sure, but nothing was certain. For generations, the Dyer family had been the ones that the town called upon to take care of these unusual problems. They were sort of caretakers for the supernatural. It was an extremely important job, although many of the residents dismissed them as crazy charlatans. The officials that actually ran Lamplight Woods knew better, though. Both the mayor and the town sheriff understood just what the Dyers did and how their family kept things from spiraling out of control. They saw Michael's father, Gerald, as a valuable asset and were willing to look the other way when it came to certain things to maintain the town peace. I felt the familiar twinge in my chest. The abuse of his son just so happened to be one of those ignored issues. I glanced over at the door. A large part of me wanted to march inside and put an end to Gerald Dyer. It wasn't the first time that particular thought had crossed my mind. Michael slid his hand into mine. "I'm okay," he said again before kissing me on the forehead. "Let me go grab my bike and we can get going." I blinked. "You have a destination in mind?" I asked. He grinned, wincing slightly as the gesture pulled at the bruise on his face. "Absolutely." "And are you going to share that destination with me?" He gave me another quick kiss, this time on the lips. Not waiting for me to respond, he jogged up the driveway to collect his bike from somewhere around the back of the house. As he disappeared behind the building, I couldn't help but shake my head and chuckle to myself. I recognized that look on his face. It was the look that he got when he had some family business to take care of. Most people in the world were, rightly so, afraid of things that went bump in the night. Michael was drawn towards them with an almost childlike glee. His grandfather used to say that he was born for the life his family lived. I watched Michael reappear from around the back of the house with his bike in his hands, his pack now on his back. He flashed me a quick smile as he climbed onto the seat, and I returned it automatically. There was something infectious about his enthusiasm, even though I was well aware that we were likely headed directly toward trouble. I slid onto my own bike, and we began to ride. As we picked up speed and entered the same stretch of trees I had passed on my way to Forgotten Tales, they blurred together in a streak of green and brown. Instead of going back towards my neighborhood when we reached the spot that I had originally turned, we went in the opposite direction, towards town. As we rode, I felt my worries about Michael slip away. I knew that they would return, but at that exact moment, we were both free of them. We were together, and nothing from our horrible home lives could touch us when we were. That wasn't really true, obviously, but it's how it felt. He was in the lead, and he glanced back over his shoulder at me. There was a wide, dumb smile on his face. I smiled back, feeling the same joy that this complicated and stronger than he should ever have to be boy was. This was our time, and no one else's. We were approaching the edge of town now, the buildings coming into sight ahead in the distance. I forced myself to stop thinking such overly dramatic thoughts and hurried to pull up alongside Michael. Together we crossed the rest of the distance and rode into the downtown area of Lamplight Woods. The word downtown was being generous. There wasn't much to the town proper, just a dozen buildings housing the local government and businesses. We parked our bikes in front of Grayson's general store. "Something happening at Grayson's?" I asked as we locked our bikes onto the metal rack. "Not unless you count a sale on fishing rods as something happening," Michael answered. "I just need to pick up some salt." I narrowed my eyes. Salt. As in what's used for purification and protection from any number of nasty things? I could just be making margaritas. You never know. I put one hand up to my still aching head. Please be joking. I can't take any more alcohol after last night. He raised his eyebrows. "Don't worry, my dear. I have something far more interesting planned for today than a couple of mixed cocktails. Much more interesting." That something more interesting just happened to be at a house that I didn't know still existed. A couple of miles outside of town, we turned onto an old and mostly overgrown road. According to Michael, it was called Durnsley Road, but I wasn't sure that there was enough of a visible path to warrant it having a name. It was in really rough shape. The bikes bounced and jerked as they traveled down the broken pavement. I didn't recognize the road itself, but I did know the direction that we were headed in. That was one of the paths that led towards the abandoned Ambrose Logging Company property. "You know how Ambrose moved out back in the early 80s? Michael asked, as if he was reading my mind. "Well, when they were still operating, they had a few areas on their property where they built neighborhoods for their out-of-town employees to live. Those were abandoned with the mill and other structures." "Until recently?" I questioned. "Yeah, apparently some of the outer areas of the property reverted ownership to the town last year. One of the houses in those defunct neighborhoods was bought by a woman named Wendy Klein." "Why in the world would she want to live out in the middle of nowhere?" He shot me a half smile. "Oh, I don't know. Seems preferable to being around all the crazies in town." I returned the smile. "You make a good point." It took a while, but we eventually arrived at the neighborhood. It consisted of 6 small houses, all 2-story Cape Cods that had seen better days. Most of them looked like a stiff breeze would knock them over. There was one exception, though, and that was the house at the end of the street that just so happened to be our destination. While it was certainly worn down, there were signs of some recent repairs. We set down our bikes in the yard and walked over to the house. Michael surprised me by not going to the front door and instead around to the back. It had rained the night before, and we had to slosh our way through water and mud to reach it. He raised his hand and knocked on the door. As we waited for a response, my attention was drawn to a small wind chime at the edge of the roof. It tinkled pleasantly as the breeze moved it. The door opened. I looked away from the wind chime in time to see Michael smile as the woman, in her late 30s or early 40s, answered the door. "Who are you?" she demanded. I'm Michael Dyer, he replied pleasantly. This is Evelyn Stone. I received your message about the, incidents in your home. The woman's eyes narrowed. I was expecting Gerald Dyer, not you. I'm sorry if there was some sort of miscommunication. I was asked to come over instead of my father because this sort of thing is my specialty. My grandfather Charles saw to that. My father is more involved with outdoor phenomena. He was lying. I wasn't sure why, but he was. I made sure not to let my confusion show on my face. Aren't you a little young? The woman asked. I suppose that I am, Miss Klein, Michael answered easily with a small laugh. What I lack in age, I more than make up for in experience, though. I've been learning about these kinds of things since I was a toddler, and I've successfully handled dozens of cases. Trust me, I'm more than qualified to help you with your problem. She stared at him for another moment before turning her attention to me. And your friend? He shot me a mischievous glance. She's here to set up the equipment and take notes. It helps to have an assistant. My eyes narrowed and I had to bite my tongue to avoid making an expletive-laced comment. He was purposefully poking me. He knew that I hated it when he did that, and yet he was constantly doing it. Sure, I did the same thing to him, but the difference was that when I did it, I was being adorable, and when he did it, he was just an ass. Two different things. All right, Klein said as she opened the door wider. Come on in. Michael nodded politely as he entered the house, and I did the same as I followed. Inside was a small kitchen, and beyond it was an entryway with a staircase leading up. On both sides were doorways leading into other rooms. One to a dining room and the other to a laundry room. The wooden floors and walls were scuffed but clean. It's still a work in progress, Klein said almost apologetically. I'm having to do a little bit at a time as my finances allow. I'm impressed, Michael said, and this time he was telling the truth. You did all of this yourself? The improvements, I mean? Klein visibly stiffened. Why is that so surprising? I'm sorry, I didn't mean anything by it. I just meant that this is a lot of work for one person. I think that I would have given up after putting out a welcome mat. Her demeanor softened. Believe me, there have been times that I've considered it. She crossed her arms. So how does this work exactly? We turn off all the lights and light some candles and you start talking to spirits? He grunted. No, sorry. I handle things a bit differently than they do in Bad Exorcist ripoffs. I like to eliminate all other possibilities first before declaring a haunting. Why don't you take us to the place that's had the most activity? Klein led the way up the stairs. As we walked, Michael leaned in close so that only I could hear him. She's been experiencing certain events in the house, he whispered into my ear. Strange sounds, objects moved, a sense of being watched. She finally called the police yesterday to ask if there was someone that could look into it, and they referred her to my dad. And he didn't really give it to you? I replied as quietly as I could. Well, no, but he was so wasted at the time the call came that I answered it. He's still drunk today, so fuck him. I'm better at this than he is anyway. When we reached the top of the stairs, Klein turned right and we followed her into the master bedroom. She stepped out of the way so that we could enter and waved a hand vaguely. Things have happened all over the house, but this is where there's been the most action, she said. Michael nodded and set the backpack he was carrying on the floor. He opened it and dug around inside for a moment before pulling out a small rectangular object. He moved the pack off to one side so that it was out of the way. What's that? Klein asked. Some sort of ghost detector? There was a note of derision in her voice. I never understood why those types of comments were so common in these types of circumstances. She was the one that had asked for help, but she was now talking down to that help. It was so stupid. It's a magnifier, Michael answered, not bothering to conceal the amusement in his voice as he flicked the switch to make the lens slide out. Oh, I see. I do have some, specialized things with me. But like I said, I don't like to start under the assumption that it's a haunting. That can lead to all kinds of false findings. What else could it possibly be? He shrugged. You'd be amazed at what old pipes can do. Pardon me for a few minutes. Michael began to slowly inspect the walls of the room with the magnifier. He went over every inch carefully, making sure not to miss anything. I crossed my arms as he did so, trying not to feel useless as he did all the work without including me. I reminded myself that he wasn't trying to exclude me, and that he did trust me to help. He just went off into his own little world during these kinds of things. It wasn't a conscious decision. When he finished with the final wall, he turned his attention to the ceiling. It was fairly high, and he had to take off his shoes and stand on the bed to reach it. Something must have caught his attention. Carefully walking across the soft top of the bed, he braced himself with one hand on the far wall and leaned out over the gap towards it. There's a very slight discoloration here, he muttered, more to himself than to us. Putting the magnifier into his pocket, he touched the discoloration with the tip of his index finger. Did you find something? I asked. Yeah, but not what we're looking for, Michael said as he got back down off the bed. It's also something that you're not going to like, Miss Klein. I'm pretty sure that your roof has a leak. You're kidding me, the woman said with frustration evident in her voice. Unfortunately not. There's a wet spot up there from the leak. Wonderful. Just wonderful. I'll add it to the list of the 10,000 things I need to fix. You didn't find anything having to do with a haunting? He shook his head. Not yet. I have a few other things that I'm going to try, but usually there's some sort of physical evidence of a haunting when one happens. Klein stared at him for a moment before saying, I'm not crazy. Things have really been happening. Michael held up one hand. I didn't say that you're crazy, and I don't think that you are. No physical evidence could mean that a haunting is originating from somewhere else in the house, even though this is where you've experienced it the most. It could also mean that we're looking for something that isn't a spirit. One step at a time, though. There's still a lot of ground to cover. We continued our walk through of the house. As we did so, Michael took notes on a small pad he had brought with him. We didn't find much during the inspection, certainly nothing that would indicate a haunting. Michael was completely focused on examining the structure of the house, but I began to notice a few oddities that had more to do with Klein than the building. At first I couldn't be sure, but by the time we finished with the last upstairs room, I was certain that the conclusion I had come to was correct. How long have you been a practicing witch, Miss Klein? I asked as we were walking back into the main hallway. Klein stopped in her tracks and snapped her head towards me. She narrowed her eyes and stared at me for a long moment. I wondered if I had crossed some sort of line. I hadn't intended the question to be accusatory or insulting. How do you know that I'm a witch? She asked in a flat voice. Oh, a few reasons, I replied, feeling a bit uncomfortable. I saw the holly bushes that looked recently planted in the flower beds, and there's also a wind chime by the back door. Those are traditionally used to keep away malevolent spirits. There are some other things scattered around the house, like the woven wreath in your bedroom. Her expression slowly changed from unfriendly to curious. That's very perceptive of you. I've been a practicing Wiccan since I was a little girl. I'm not into anything that would have caused what I've been experiencing, though. She led the way back down the stairs. As we descended, Michael leaned towards me. That is why I bring you along, he whispered with a smile. I completely missed that. Do you think it has something to do with what's been happening to her? I asked. I don't know. It's hard to say. As Michael began a thorough examination of the downstairs areas, I took the opportunity to look around myself. There were a few more signs that a witch lived in the house, such as the oddest collection of herbs and roots that I'd ever seen, but otherwise, everything looked normal. I was starting to feel antsy. I was more of a doer than a watcher. Do you have a cellar? I asked eventually. I know that a lot of these older homes in Lamplight Woods have them. I do, Klein answered with a nod. It's along the right side of the house if you're looking at it from the road. I've never gone down there. There's a huge lock on it, and I don't have a key for it. I paused. You bought a house without checking its cellar? She smiled sheepishly. Yeah, I know. It sounds dumb. I didn't have any other options in my price range, though. Besides, the realtor told me that it's packed with debris and is inaccessible. My plan is to have it opened and inspected sometime this summer. Happy to have something to do, I excused myself and went outside. Michael was so absorbed in his work that he barely acknowledged me. I shook my head as I walked around the house. I somehow loved and hated his single-mindedness at the same time. The entrance to the cellar was behind a couple of overgrown shrubs that had seen better days. I pushed the branches aside. There was a set of double doors made from beaten planks, and a chain was wrapped around the handles and secured with a heavy padlock. I knelt down to get a better look, wincing as I felt mud squishing around my knee. Almost immediately, I stood back up, staring at the door suspiciously. Something was very wrong. I called out for Klein, then called a second time when she didn't come outside. This time, she hurried over to me. What? She demanded. What happened? Tell me why you think your house is haunted, I said, ignoring her question. What exactly happened? It's important. Let's see. Things have been moved around. I've heard voices in the middle of the night, voices that seem to come from nowhere. Sometimes I'll hear someone walking up and down the stairs when I'm the only one here. I felt a chill run down my back. Okay, I said slowly, trying to keep my voice calm. Here's what I need you to do. We're going to go back inside, and you're going to get your car keys and coat. While you're doing that, I'm going to use your phone. I promise that I'll explain after. Is this some kind of joke? Klein asked in a strained voice. No joke. Go. Get your things. We both went back inside. As Klein rushed past him into the living room, Michael raised an eyebrow and came over to me. What the hell's going on, Evie? He asked, looking over his shoulder to make sure that Klein couldn't hear us. Trust me, I said simply, grabbing the phone receiver off of its hook and dialing. Just listen. His expression made it clear that he wanted to pursue things further, but instead he nodded and took a step back so that he wasn't crowding me. I kept my eyes on him as I waited impatiently for the call to connect. Lamplight Woods Sheriff's Office, a gruff voice said finally. Sheriff Peterson, this is Evelyn Stone, I said, forcing myself to speak slowly and clearly. I'm here at Wendy Klein's house with Michael Dyer. Michael Dyer? Gerald is supposed to be there. Well, he's not, and we are. Listen, we've been looking around, and there's evidence of a home invasion, an ongoing one. Michael's eyes widened. Ongoing home, Peterson repeated. What are you talking about? I thought it was one of those spooky things you people are into. I didn't appreciate his dismissive tone, but I forced down a retort. She's been hearing noises and noticing things that are out of place. Like I said, we've been looking around, and on the side of her house is the entrance to her cellar. She hasn't been down there, but the lock and handles are clean. You're not making any sense, Stone. Everything else is covered in mold and grime. You know how these old houses in Lamplight Woods get. Give them 10 minutes and they're buried in filth. The lock and handles are clean, though. They've been seeing a lot of use. There was a long pause. You think someone has been entering the house through the cellar? I nodded, belatedly realizing he couldn't see the gesture. That's what I'm thinking, yes. Listen, the lock is open right now. Someone made it look like it's closed, but it isn't. It wouldn't be hard for someone to go down past the doors, loop the chain around the handles, slide in the lock, and pull the door shut behind them. You're sure about this? Peterson asked intently. No, I'm not, but... I was interrupted by a scream. My head snapped toward the direction of the living room, just in time to see someone cross the distance between the stairs and Klein. The woman was slammed into the wall and slumped down to the floor motionless. The intruder was a man, at least I thought that he was. It was hard to tell for sure because he was covered in muck, and all the mud hid many of his features. He was very thin, and his ragged clothes were almost hanging off of his body. His eyes were wild, and his filthy, cracked teeth were bared. Before we could fully process what was happening, the man ran at Michael. He barely managed to get his hands up before he was tackled onto the kitchen tile. The man was frighteningly fast, and his hands were instantly wrapped around Michael's throat. Without thinking, I took 3 steps forward and struck the man on the side of the head with the phone receiver. He didn't even flinch. I had hit him hard enough to make his temple bleed, but he didn't seem to notice. Not knowing what else to do, I wrapped the phone cord around his neck and pulled as hard as I could. The cord bit into his throat. He just kept squeezing. Using one hand to keep the cord tight, I used the other to open the drawers that were within my reach. Panic was quickly overtaking me. He was going to kill Michael. This thing was going to kill him, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I pulled the drawers out of the counter and let them drop to the floor. When the 3rd drawer hit the ground, I saw light glint off of metal. I grabbed the meat tenderizer, released the cord, and backed up slightly before swinging it as hard as I could. Like the phone, the tenderizer hit him in the temple. This was a much heavier object, however, and it wasn't made of cheap plastic. The tenderizer connected with a sickening crunch. When I pulled it away, there was a sucking sound, and skin, blood, and bone were stuck to it. The man's eyes rolled up into his head as his grip released. He fell to one side and remained still. At first, I thought he was dead. I was convinced that I had just killed someone, and in my state of shock, I wasn't sure how to feel about that. It wasn't until I noticed that his chest was rising and falling that I knew that he was still breathing. Tearing my attention away from the man, I knelt down next to Michael and helped him lift his head as he coughed and hacked. "Are you okay?" I asked nervously. "Please tell me you're okay." He nodded weakly and managed to rasp out, "I'm okay." "Oh, thank God. You are not allowed to die ever. You understand?" His laugh quickly turned into more coughing. "I won't. I'm afraid you'll bring me back and murder me if I do."